huge fan of the Beatles, and their recordings. I'm sure many of you are. And Geoff really needs no introduction, but Elliot gave him a bit of one, and I'll just give a little kind of a tip of the iceberg. He started at EMI Abbey Road at the age of 15, at about the same time that the Beatles arrived. And so one of the great collisions in popular music and recording happened there. In 1966, 50 years ago, he became the Beatles' chief engineer, the man responsible for the distinctive sounds as they recorded the classic album Revolver. And he pioneered innovative recording techniques that changed the course of music history and studio history, things like tape loops and backwards recording and new microphone techniques for bass and drums. He would also engineer the monumental album Sgt. Pepper and Abbey Road and build the Beatles recording studio. So he's the guy generally acknowledged for bringing recording engineering into the modern era. He won Grammys for Sgt. Pepper, Abbey Road, and Band on the Run, and he also was the recipient of the Technical Grammy Award. And kind of along, as Elliot was mentioning earlier, last fall, Keith Richards inducted Scotty Moore, who was Elvis's guitar player, into the Memphis Music Hall of Fame. And Keith was saying when he was a young musician, everyone wanted to be Elvis, but he wanted to be Scotty Moore. And I think Elliot referred to what happened not long after that. Many people wanted to be John, Paul, George, or Ringo, but there was also this group of people who wanted to be Geoff Emerick. And so we're happy to have him here today. And Geoff, would you mind starting out with sort of the early years and how you got your start and what possessed you to want to be a recording engineer?
Yeah, well, from the early years, I mean, I fell in love with music from the age of probably 7 years old, and I had access to my grandmother's collection of 78 RPM records and a toy gramophone. I used to play those records on my toy gramophone and used to listen to the music and think, well, you know, if I was involved with that, but I'm using the word involved, I didn't know what it would mean. I would make certain changes in what I was hearing, and some of these recordings were like semi-classical. So I always sort of had the love for the music. It wasn't really a technical aspect at all. I wanted to be involved with creating or helping to create music, and that carried with me from the age of probably maybe even before I was 7 and all the way through to when I eventually left school, where I said to our careers officer, you know, I want to be working in a recording studio, because I knew about recording studios, and I knew roughly what was involved with the process. But I applied to many of the recording studios, say many, there were like 4 in England, major ones, and got rejection letters. And then suddenly EMI Studios, as it was then, is located in St John's Wood, an area outside of London. And the careers officer from the local school in St John's Wood was asked by Abbey Road, did they have anyone who wanted to join or work in a recording studio? And this particular careers officer had nobody. And he contacted my careers officer, and then, because he'd been trying for weeks and weeks and weeks to get me an interview and stuff at EMI. Anyway, he got contacted and he said, Geoff, I think we've got an interview at EMI. So I had my interview at EMI. And within 2 weeks later, I'd got the job. So I was about 3 months shy of being 16, I think then. But the funny part of that interview was the fact one of the questions, and it was only many years afterwards I fathomed out what it was about, was the fact he said, could I do the side elevation of a pulley wheel? Which I sort of did, you know, the V sign and he said, what's the dotted line in the middle? I said, it's the hole in the middle. And it was a few years later I realised the manager had come from the era when they used to cut straight to wax, and they used to use pulleys with weights on to turn the turntable round. So that's why he asked me the question. So I thought that was rather funny. So anyway, 2 weeks later I got the job and started as an assistant engineer, as it was termed there, and that was a button pusher because multi-track was behind the times there. It just began to creep in, And we were recording straight to stereo on most sessions, and it was quite an important job. Your job was to actually press the button to start the record mechanism on the tape machines. And it was quite an important job, especially if you were on classical sessions, because if there was any oxide build up on the heads and stuff and there were dropouts on the tape, there was no recall or recourse to come back to a multi-track to rectify the dropout on the tape. So it was an important job, you know, with a huge expense of an orchestra and so forth. So then I was, after that, promoted on to cutting playback lacquers, because we didn't have cassettes then, where the artist would come in, do a session, and they'd want to take something home, and it was on little 7-inch playback lacquers. Then I was promoted to a mastering engineer. During the time before that, I was, you know, assistant engineer on a lot of the Beatles records, like She Loves You and Some of Help, and various other things. And they came in 2 days after I actually started, because I had to learn the ropes of my job. And I said, there was this band coming down from Liverpool called the Beatles. And I said, well, can I just sit in on the session and just, you know, see you know, what the job's about? So I did. And that's when they cut How Do You Do It? And then at the end of that session, John said, we want to record one of our own songs, which was Love Me Do. So they did 3 or 2 versions of it, because they had to stop at 10 o'clock at night. Anyway, George Martin said, okay, well, you know, we'll have another session next week or 2 weeks afterwards, which was the Love Me Do session. So that was my first meeting with them. And then, as I said, I was assistant engineer on many of their single sessions and some of the album, which was a compilation thing, I guess. So anyway, after being a mastering engineer, because I was still, 17 and a half, 18, something like that, because I was cutting straight to vinyl, obviously, and remastering a lot of the American records for the European market, because what we used to do, or what the record company used to do, I think EMI was the distributor of a lot of the Tamla records and so forth, a lot of the big American records. So to save time, they used to send just the 7-inch disc to Abbey Road, and it was someone's job to copy that 7-inch disc through a stylus onto a piece of tape. So you've got the surface noise of that. And then I'd cut bad clicks out with a pair of scissors, because we didn't even use razor blades. And then I'd remaster it for the European market by making the master from the copy of the original 7-inch disc. So that's how all the Tamla stuff was issued in Europe. But that gave me an insight into some of the sounds that were coming off of American records, and I knew those sounds weren't coming out of the Abbey Road Studios. So I used to, you know, sort of experiment with ways I could to try and give things more power and more punch, which of course was breaking rules, and I could never use what I found out in practice, because, you know, I probably would have gotten the sack for that. So anyway, I was then promoted after Norman Smith, the original engineer of the Beatles, left to become a producer, and Norman was doing bands like Manfred Mann and various other bands at EMI and a lot of George Martin's bands. I took over Norman's sessions, so the first recording I did was for Manfred Mann, and it was Pretty Flamingo, which went straight to #1. Anyway, 5 months later, I was called up to the manager's office, and George Martin was up there, because I used to do a lot of George Martin sessions, because we had the same sort of sense of humour, so we sort of, you know, got on well because of that. We used to see the funny side of the most sort of miserable sort of situations. So anyway, I was called up to his office, and the manager said, George has got something to ask you, and he said, do you want to do the Beatles? And then I sort of played this little, my heart sort of sank, obviously. And I was playing this little mind game, with a little red ball was going on from yes to no, yes to no, yes to no, yes to yes. And it stopped on yes, and I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose, you know. So I said yes, and he said, well, in 2 weeks' time, we're going to start the new album, which was Revolver. Well, it wasn't titled Revolver then, but it was to become Revolver. And the first track we started to cut was Tomorrow Never Knows, and that was the working title of that was Mark 1. And at the time of the session, I think Paul knew that I was going to become their recording engineer, but the others didn't, because I had one of the mics open from the studio into the control room, and I think it was George Harrison said, where's Norman? And I realised then that they did not know that I was going to take over as the engineer. So that made me feel even worse. So So anyway, to cut long story short, when we started to do the record, first of all, John wanted his voice to sound like the Dalai Lama singing from a mountaintop 25 miles away from the studio. So all we've got in our control room is 2 stereo machines, an 8-input mixing console with limited equalization and an echo chamber. So I'm sort of stuck and panicking inside. And as luck had it, I was looking through the control room window and there was the revolving speaker, which was the Leslie speaker from the Hammond organ. And I thought, well, if we could get into the circuitry of that and put John's voice through that, that might give John, what he wants. So we did that, and of course it won John over. He thought it was absolutely fantastic. And we sort of saved that sound for the last verse of the record. And the next thing was, Ringo was getting fed up with these there was a protocol at EMI, the way you recorded drums and so forth. So he wanted a different drum sound, and I was aware of different drum sounds because of listening to the American records. So I decided to start to close mic the drums, and I brought the mics closer to the drum kit, and then the idea was on the bass drum to take the front skin off and then stuff a big sweater inside it and put the front skin back on and move the microphone closer to the bass drum. And I got in trouble for that because the rulings there were the fact you weren't supposed to put the bass drum mic closer than 18 inches to the bass drum, and I took it about 4 inches away from the front, and someone sort of snitched on me, and so the next day I was in trouble. And there was a sort of meeting with management, and in fact, in the end, I got a letter giving me permission to be able to do that on Beatles Sessions. So of course, as time went by, everyone wanted to, and I put all the drums as a mono drum set because all the Beatles stuff up until Abbey Road was monitored in mono through one loudspeaker. It was never designed for stereo, not at all. So that became the accepted way to do bass drums, and everyone else wanted to do bass drums in that fashion. So I was now sort of breaking rules, and when they didn't demand new sounds, but they wanted new sort of sounds. So the only way I could do it was to abuse the equipment. I was overdriving compressors and limiters and putting lots of. We had an outside sort of little equalizer, which had it was plus 10 or minus at 3.5, 2.7 or 10K. And sometimes on Harmony Voices, I'd put them in series, and I'd have like 30 dBs boost at 2K or 3K. So that was my limitations, really. And they tried to, going on to Pepper, they tried to reproduce some of the Revolver tracks live on stage and couldn't do it because of what we'd done. There was no equipment to reproduce any of the sounds we'd created. So when we started Pepper, John said, look, we're never going to tour again. So on this album, we're going to do things and we're going to create sounds that we know we don't have to produce on stage live. So that was the approach for Pepper.
Before we go into Pepper, could we play Tomorrow Never Knows? Mm-hmm. Because what a dramatic change that was.
Yeah, because not only that, it was the first time, because when we made Tomorrow Never Knows, there were gaps in the song. First of all, there was the drum loop. Ringo couldn't keep time to keep that steady drum beat going, so it was like two bars. And we made the drum loop, so that was like, as far as I was concerned at EMI, the first drum loop that we actually used. And then there were gaps in the song, and Paul had a little Brennell tape recorder at home, and Paul was making little tape loops, so he came in the next day or 2 days later with a plastic bag with all these loops that he'd made at home. And so this was like a synth, because we brought all the loops up on the mixing console, and we only had 8 inputs into our Red 51 mixing console then. So what we had to do, we had to commandeer more personnel, being the maintenance people, in the control rooms of the other studios, which luckily were empty. And we threaded the loops on like 3 machines because we were doing this in number 3 studio. So there were 3 machines coming from number 2 studio, and I believe another 2 machines from number 1 studio, and through tie lines, they linked it all through to our control room. So the maintenance guys were sort of holding all the loops on the tape machines with drumsticks or pencils. And suddenly we'd be playing it like a synth in our control room, and suddenly one of them would disappear, realizing when the maintenance engineer phoned up and said, "Oh, my loop's come off the pencil," you know, so then we had to stop and he had to sort of thread it back up again. So that's how we made all the loop, and we actually laid. I think we must have laid all those loops onto one track of the 4-track, obviously. Sometimes we didn't have enough tracks to do that, and some of our effects we just lay on at the time of doing the mix. But there's obviously a loop track on the 4-track on that. So that's how the loop thing came about on that.
Could you explain to us sort of, so that was recorded on 4 tracks, right?
Yeah.
How did, just if you could kind of walk us through what went on the 4 tracks of.
Well, basically, I mean, it would have started with obviously the track one would have been the drum loop. I'm just wondering if there'd be anything else with it at the same time. There may have been another percussion instrument, but there would have been, well, I know we didn't do 4/4 on that, I'm sure we didn't. So then all the next set of overdubs, obviously we've got the loops, they were obviously dropped into the right spots, I guess. And then all the other, I mean, the piano thing is from another, from an outtake, and then that wasn't like dubbed on the end, it was just, we'd actually stopped the tape and that happened to be one of the outtakes that came in on another track on the end. Obviously there's the vocal track, and so track one's just basically the drum track with maybe some percussion added because we were doing the loop, so that was no problem. And then all the other instruments on track 2 and loops and vocals. I don't think we did 4/4 on that at all. We hadn't really got into the realms of doing 4-track to 4-track, and we were on 1-inch 4-track as well, not 1/2-inch.
Yeah, because I think earlier when you hear the stories about making these on 4 tracks, you didn't realize it was more than one. You were bouncing from one 4-track to the other and things like that.
Yeah, but only for. I mean, it wasn't like a thing that we said, "Oh, we're going to do 4/4 when we start doing this track." It was like something. "Oh, we need another track. Oh dear, we got to do a 4-track to 4-track." Because when we recorded all these records, all the finished sounds and all the reverbs and the tape echoes or whatever, and the balance of the instruments all on one track was locked in, and that's the way it was finished. It wasn't left up to the mix to say, "Oh, well, we need more equalization on this." So it was just the finished, locked-in rhythm track, and luckily, you know, if the intention was maybe to overdub a piano in certain parts in the planned sort of production of it, you'd realise once you'd cut your rhythm track that the piano didn't fit because of the equalization possibly that you'd put on the basic rhythm track, so you'd use harpsichord instead. So gradually you could gradually build up the finished sounds, and we made decisions, and once the decision was made, it was great whatever we'd done, you know.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear. You know, I listened to Revolver and Sgt. Pepper's. I was driving here on Sunday, and you know, another interesting thing to me about Revolver is because you have Here, There, and Everywhere. From that to Tomorrow Never Knows is pretty dramatic differences of all the various. Every song is like totally a different approach, where previously there was a lot of similarity from song to song on their albums.
Yeah. And getting back to the 4-track to 4-track situation, which was, I think, happened on Pepper. There was an instance on one of the songs from Pepper when we needed one more track because Ringo wanted to overdub a tambourine, and we had to do a 4-track to 4-track reduction to open up one track to just put a tambourine on. You know, so that's what used to happen. Yeah. And of course, my saving grace on Revolver, of course, was the Fairchild 660 limiter, because that was what was giving us the great, you know, guitar sounds, because no one up to that point had heard anything like this from coming out of their studios, because, you know, up to that point it was like Cliff Richard and the Shadows, and it was this, you know, sort of more sort of weaker drum sound, and guitar sounds were very clean and nice. And suddenly I realised that if you put the guitars through the Fairchild and overdrove it, they came, you know, right up into your face, and I was adding a lot of equalisation to them, and also with the vocals as well. So that was my saving grace on a lot of this thing, plus the fact of the outlet compressor, which I've forgotten the number of. But being sort of naive and young at that time, one of my theories also was that if a bass amp can push bass out, then a bass speaker or a loudspeaker can bring bass back in. So I was only on two songs, which was Rain and Paperback Writer, I think. that I used a loudspeaker as the microphone to record the bass, but it was really hard to control. So I was, I believe that's like sort of normal practice now sometimes with bass amps and bass drum mics to have a Yamaha speaker as one of the inputs into the mics.
Before we move on to Pepper, now you mentioned like Rain and Paperback Writer. Now, I'm a kid listening to these new singles on the radio, and like each time there's a new song or new single, it's a dramatic difference from what came before. So I think we were talking earlier about very speeding the tape on Rain. How did you accomplish the Rain track? If you could give us a little sort of some inside scoop on that.
Yeah, because we used to, every time we sort of would record a finished rhythm track just to hear it either faster or slower to see if it added any sort of texture or colour to the feel of the rhythm track. We'd do that. But when we did Rain, we knew what happens when you slow drums down. So we wanted this different sort of texture to the drums. So what we actually did, it would mean if we were on vari speed, every time we wanted to work on that song, we'd have to get it out the box and put the machine on vari speed to be able to play it at the speed that it was meant to be heard at. So what we actually did, we actually figured out the speed by trial and error probably sometimes, then record a little bit of the drums and then play it back at 15 IPS, which was a lock speed. So we'd actually record it faster than the 15 IPS. So we didn't have to put the machine on vari speed every time we wanted to hear it. It was locked in at the slow speed at 15 IPS.
Another thing I remember about Paperback Writer is I'd never heard a bass sound like that before. No. And I know that you mentioned your mastering background. Was that kind of the Motown bass idea of getting it?
Yeah, that was based on that. And also, there was a guy called Tony Clark, because there was this new breed of young people starting to infiltrate EMI. And Tony was a mastering engineer, and Tony was of my thinking that we want to get bass on the records like the American records, which there was limitations within EMI about how much bass you were allowed to put on a record. So Tony had a device that the EMI had actually developed. I think it was called ATOC. What that stood for, I've got no idea. It lasted in the building for about 6 months and then disappeared. But he actually used it on Paperback Writer. I don't know exactly what it did, but so he, apart from me trying to get this forceful bass sound, he was doing the same thing on the mastering side. But on those two records like Rain and Paperback Writer, you have to really, to get the impact of that, listen to the 7-inch mono single, because that's what it was made for,
I will go back and do that. Now, for Pepper, you actually recorded Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane as singles before you. Tell us a little bit about how that came about and how those weren't those supposed to originally be?
That was the start, because that was the start of the Sgt. Pepper album, Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, and EMI were desperate for a single, so they had to relent to EMI's wishes and give those two tracks up to be issued as a single, and I don't think it even reached #1, did it? In England, I don't think it did.
I think it did in America.
Yeah, but it didn't. It was some ballad song. I think like Edelweiss. I think it was. Reached #1, and that reached #2.
Because also people may not know that in those days, the singles and albums were separate things. So songs that were singles wouldn't also be on the album like it is today. So
yeah.
Now, also, I remember from when you did our interview a few years ago in Memphis, you explained how you created the version of Strawberry Fields Forever that we all know. So with splicing different takes and things.
Yes, yeah. I might get this the wrong way around, but what happened, we recorded Strawberry Fields, and John was sort of happy with it, but we could tell by his face probably he wasn't really happy with it. So about two weeks later, he came and said, I want to re-record Strawberry Fields again. And he said, I want it more aggressive and like aggressive, orchestral instruments at the end and stuff. So we re-recorded it. And then I think it was the day after we'd finished it, he came in and said, I really liked the first half of the first version we did and the second half of the new version. And the problem was they were two different tempos and they were different keys. So George and I put our heads together on this and thought, well, what we had to, so we mixed both versions, and we had a third machine to record what we were going to do onto this third quarter-inch machine. So on the first machine, I had to gradually speed up, I might have got this the wrong way around, gradually speed up the first half to marry the tempo and the key of where it enters the second half. And I think I had that on the second one on vari speed. And then where the edit point was going to be, I then gradually sped up or slowed down the second version. So the only way I could do it was to do, as I said before, we didn't use razor blades for editing there, and we had little brass scissors. So I did a little, instead of a 45-degree cut, I couldn't do that because I knew it would jump. So I sort of snipped a long sort of crossfade cut on the quarter-inch. And that's what I did, and it actually worked. But I mean, I'm making it sound a lot sort of simpler than it really was. But I mean, today you could just press a couple of buttons and you've done it, and which is But I guess in a sense this has been like a pioneer, I suppose. We were virtually doing the impossible because it wasn't. No one else would have. They just would have poo-pooed it off. I mean, in the Beatles vocabulary, there was no words such as no, you can't, or the word no. There was always a way round of finding an answer to their questions, or which was good for us because we tried to give them answers to whatever they wanted to do.
Once again, me as a fan hearing "Strawberry Fields Forever" and "Penny Lane," I mean, how dramatic, two sides were to a single, and that in itself was amazing. I guess, one's a John song and one's a Paul song, I guess. How did you, by the time you got to Sgt. Pepper, how did you sort of approach John's songs and Paul's songs? Were they different, or was it sort of the same?
No, still the same. I mean, the magic of their material really was like, Paul was like always to me the romantic, and John was the aggressive one, and it was the combination of the two people that made these great sort of records. It was because all they really came into the studio with was a lyric. There was no like real demos, and they had an idea of how they would do it with what instrumentation they do the song with. So we might spend 4 or 5 hours with guitar, piano, or electric guitar, piano, and something else, and Ringo doing some sort of rhythm pattern. And we might spend 4 or 5 hours doing that and realizing it was probably getting nowhere, and realizing that instrumentation was the wrong instrumentation for the song. So that would get changed maybe into acoustic guitars and harpsichord or organ, and rhythm, and Ringo would change his rhythm pattern. And then that would be the accepted way of the way the song was to be done. And often when you're doing that, mistakes happen, and in the arrangement, and sometimes those mistakes are really good. So we used to embellish those mistakes. So that's how some of those really, I call them, really great arrangements happen by mistakes happening on the run-throughs of the construction of the songs. So that's how basically all those songs were made, and I had the luxury of time because it was taking time for the routining of those songs, being limited on the equipment we had, and it was also really hard to get, for instance, if there were 2 electric guitars involved, and we're listening to one loudspeaker for mono, to get each guitar to go in its own place and its own plane with its own proper equalization and reverbs. Although we didn't use a lot of reverbs or echoes, But I never really used to, because I'm just listening to sounds and tonalities when I'm constructing these mixings of the songs. And often I'd realise that maybe John's guitar sounded fine, but George's wasn't quite making it, or vice versa. And I'd try and do what I could with the amplifier because of my equalisation limitations, and then realise even that wouldn't work. So I'd just say to George or John, can you just use another guitar that's a bit brighter? I was never aware sometimes of what guitars they were even playing because I was just listening, So that's what used to happen on the guitar side. And sometimes it would take like 2 hours. And as I said, I had the luxury of time to actually get those two guitars to come out note for note in their own place from one loudspeaker. So it was really hard, but rewarding at the same time. And that's how all that stuff was constructed. There's no real sounds that clutter or cover other sounds. But that, as I said, that was having the luxury of time.
And speaking of the luxury of time, once again, me as being a fan, and the idea that, so they had stopped touring so that they could spend more time in the studio, and because they were the biggest band in the world. I guess the other person that I remember hearing of this is Brian Wilson got to spend a lot of time in the studio, and I know they were very influenced by Pet Sounds and everything. So that's another point where I think the history of recording changed because you got to spend all this time, and you were trying to make them happy, which was probably impossible. Mm-hmm. But and like you said, they wouldn't take no for an answer on anything, and you create. And when you listen, the idea of Revolver, of course, was amazing. Then Sgt. Pepper, the fact that was 4+4, you're bouncing between 4 tracks, and you're having to commit the EQ and reverb and all that as you're putting down, and it's an amazing accomplishment. I think everyone here would acknowledge who are recording engineers who have a much easier way of accomplishing all that today. Yeah,
I mean it was great fun, and as I said, extremely rewarding once you'd actually capture that. And we knew that when we were, I think on Mr. Kite on Pepper we did 4-track to 4-track to 4-track. But a lot of the sound effects across the benefit of Mr. Kite are being sent from stereo machines because we didn't have any more tracks on the 4 tracks because the master's still going to end up on 1 4-track to lay stuff on.
Now, speaking for the benefit of Mr. Kite, for those who have not heard this story, could you explain sort of the organ calliope sounds and how you accomplished that?
Well, but yeah, basically there were like some backwards glockenspiels recorded and sped up, and also EMI had an extensive sound effects library with like brass bands and steam organs and all sorts of stuff that a guy called Stuart Eltham used to collect. He was like the sound effects man, plus one of the finest recording engineers as well at EMI at that time. He used to do a lot of classical recordings and middle of the road recordings, and he taught me a lot as well. But Stuart was like the curator of all the sound effects. So we went up into the sound effects library and copied the sound effects that we thought we'd need and chopped them all up into little bits and threw them up in the air. And they all landed on the floor, and then we stuck them all back together again. And that was that. If that answers your question. I think we did a similar thing for Yellow Submarine as well. And I know on one occasion, I think it may have been Yellow Submarine on the brass band thing, we threw them all up in the air and I stuck them all back together, and I stuck them all back together in the right order.
No, it's all amazing. I mean, like now there's different ways of accomplishing that, but you were really kind of sort of making this up on the fly.
Yeah, and getting back to Mr. Kite again, the way John could only express himself in a certain way. And he actually, his direction on Mr. Kite was he wanted to smell the sawdust on the floor. And that's how he interpreted the way he wanted to hear that, by smelling the sawdust. Yeah.
Now, we could spend like an hour just talking about Pepper, but I've got to ask you about A Day in the Life, which is at the time, hearing this as a kid, and the things that had come before, so Revolver gives you a little bit of prep for what's coming, but it was beyond mind-blowing to hear Sgt. Pepper at that point in time, and but A Day in the Life, wow, so could you kind of take us through how you accomplished that?
Yeah, so going back to that, it was like one of the biggest moments of my life because, from the very outset of the song, when John just ran through it in the studio, and I was down in the studio And you could just feel the magic in the vocal on that. And of course, John, as I said, did not like the sound of his voice. He always wanted something added to it, which was the repeat echo. So it was actually recorded with that repeat echo. So anyway, we went back up into the control room, and we were about to start recording the song in its basic form. And like shivers ran down your back from that vocal performance, So there were gaps left in the song. No one knew what was going to go into the gaps. And I wanted to get on those drum breaks in the song. I wanted to get like a drum sound of drums that no one had ever heard before. So what I did, again being naive, I guess in a sense, took the bottom skins off the tom-toms and put some D19s in glass jugs with towels wrapped around them underneath the toms. The theory being that the attack comes from the top and the tonality comes from the bottom. So that's how I recorded the drums, and no one, you have to go back to those days, no one had ever heard drums sound like that, and it was just amazing. So when it came to do the orchestral part, I think it was, someone said to George Martin, we need a 90-piece orchestra to go in those gaps. And then George said, well, EMI won't pay for that because EMI is still paying for the sessions. So then Ringo said, well, let's get a 45-piece orchestra and put it on twice. So anyway, and the direction to the orchestra which took a long time to get through to them because they were classical musicians, was the score, I think, was like 24 bars, and you start on this note, and you end up after the 24th bar on this note, but you do it in your own time, not listening to the musician next to you. And because they said, well, we can't do that. And I guess musicians then had to have the notes written. There was no way they were going to improvise themselves. So anyway, it was like a 20-minute discussion from George Martin to the orchestra, and they're still saying, no, we can't do it. And George is saying, well, just don't listen to the person next to you, just in your own time, go from that note to that note. Someone's going to count the bars for you. You just reach that note whenever you want to, after over 24 bars. So then, plus the fact that night they were asked to wear tuxedos and all these funny noses and funny glasses and all these novelty things and stuff. So that added to the tension. Then Paul had a discussion with them about, no, come on, you can do it, And this is like 35 minutes after they were supposed to be doing this. Luckily there was David Mason, who'd played the piccolo trumpet on Penny Lane, and Alan Civil, who'd done the French horn on For No One, who were principal brass players within, I think it was the Philharmonic or the Philharmonia Orchestra at that time. And he said, no, come on, lads, we can do this, because they played on a couple of the singles, and what was actually what was happening in front of our eyes now was the fact this barrier between the classical people and the pop people was gradually being broken down slightly, and it was. From that night, it was broken down. So anyway, we did start to do the recording, and they did eventually do the one note to the second note in the 24 bars with Mal Evans counting with the alarm clock going off to alert them that the 23rd bar was coming up, so the 24th bar was the next bar. So what we actually did on that as well, for the first time we tried to lock two 4-track machines together. And the way we did that was to actually pulse both motors with a 50-cycle pulse. But there was no sort of lockable way of doing it, so we had to put a grease mark on because we laid down the first orchestral recording on track 4 of the master 4-track. So then we put a grease pencil mark on both machines, put this one into play and this one into record, and did another pass on the orchestra, and then we did another 3 passes on the orchestra without them knowing. Eventually they did know that we'd actually recorded them 5 times, and they actually did get paid for that. But that night they did not know what we'd done. Where the piano chord comes in on the end, that came about 2 weeks later when Paul had an idea the night we'd done the orchestra to put this sort of sort of sound, which would have been where the piano is, and it didn't work because there was a lot of invited guests like the Rolling Stones, and some of the Monkees were there, I believe, and a few other people to add to the festivities while all this orchestral thing's going on. There is a 16mm film that flies around on YouTube, I think, sometimes of the session. So anyway, Richard and myself that night, we set up a monitor mix, and the control room, it was done in number 1 at Abbey Road, and the control room was quite small, and a couple of the Rolling Stones were in the back of the control room, and Ron Richards, who was the producer of the Hollies, was sitting on the floor by the mixing console. And so Richard and I played it back, and it was like the most amazing thing you've ever heard in your life, and there was absolute silence at the end of the playback. And Ron had his head in his hands, and he said, I'm going to give the business up. You know, and this is the guy that produces the Hollies, and he was really serious. And if you'd have been there that night, you would have realised what we'd actually listened to, and it was like going from a square black and white picture to CinemaScope Technicolor. It was just amazing. It really was.
So is there any other story from Pepper before we move on to other things that you would like to share with
I'm
everyone?
sure there are many, but I can't remember them unless you remind me.
Okay. Well, now,
the one silly thing was they were always looking for, I may have been on Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds one night. They was always looking for something weird and different, so that the suggestion was we get strobe lights in the studio. So they're down in the studio and they're walking around, and it looks like Charlie Chaplin sort of walking around. So after about 10 minutes, they were going to do some vocals on Lucy in the Sky. So after about 10 minutes, they all get migraines and have to go home.
Another trailblazing moment was All You Need Is Love. Can you walk us through how that came about and the challenges to you to pull off what they wanted to pull off at that point in time?
Well, as you know, it was the first satellite link up throughout the world, and I think it was, I don't know, 400 million people watched it, because it went after our insert, it went to New Zealand and it went around the world. So I think it was quoted like 400 million people saw this thing live, you know. So anyway, it was live, and there was a basic little rhythm track, was a little harpsichord thing and a little stick noise that the Ringo did, and all of John's vocal was live. And for the first time, if you see the footage of that, John's chewing gum because he was so nervous. And the only thing we replaced was just one line of vocal and a little snare roll at the beginning. Anyway, the broadcast happened, and it went on 25 seconds early. And George Martin and I had a bottle of whiskey on the mixing console, and that had to be flown under the mixing console because it went on. We're going on air 25 seconds early, so we did. And after the session, we mixed it in number 2 to do a rough mix, because it was going to be this was on the Sunday, and it was going to be in the shops on the following Friday. So we did a mix in number 2 that night, which didn't take very long. We said, well, let's just review it the next day, which was the Monday, and we came in and listened to it, and it sounded fine. And it went down into the factory, it was mastered and went to the factory and was in the shops on the Friday. But I mean, we were obviously terribly nervous, you know, because Richard's only, I was like, 20? Richard was 19, and there we are, just in charge of this whole thing, you know.
Yeah, it's just hard to fathom what could have been, you know, the pressure, as you would think of something like that.
Yeah.
Well, let's, in the interest of time, let's jump ahead to Abbey Road. And so by Abbey Road, you have 8 tracks, and were you working on a new mixing console for that? Can you kind of...
Yeah, which the new mixing console was the TG desk, and which was EMI's first transistorized mixing console. And because over the years we'd been wanting, you know, various things to be available to us, like selectable equalization, which we never had before. And on the TG desk, it had a limiter and compressor on every channel, and it was just amazing. Except when we started to do the Abbey Road album, we couldn't get the same snare sound or the bass drum sound or the guitar sounds, or even some of the vocal sounds, because of the limitations in those days, I guess, of the transistors against the tube equipment. So for the first 3 days, everyone was sort of, you know, down in the dumps sort of thing, because we weren't getting what we expected to get. But then after, you know, there were suggestions that we bring the Red 51 mixing console back in, which was impossible. So it was an accepted fact that this was going to be our new mixing console. And within a few days, it was just accepted as this is the new sound. But it gave us the luxury of being able to record drums in stereo for the first time. It was never recorded for mono or issued in mono. It was just stereo, Abbey Road. But as I said, and because of the transistor situation, it gave it a certain texture, because I think had it been done on the Red 51 desk, which had all that punch, the basic rhythm tracks would have been a lot more punchy and harder, and consequently all the overdubs that went with those rhythm tracks would have been harder as well, so the album would have sounded entirely different. And it was just the texture of the transistors that gave it the texture that it has. I mean, listening to it now, it's really a nice, beautiful, sort of open, much different sound.
Right, and also the first use of synthesizers that I knew of, it's the textures on that are truly amazing.
Yeah,
one thing I wanted to make sure we talked about is the mono mixes were what you spent all the time on up until Abbey Road. So
yeah.
would you share that with your why mono and why?
Well, yeah. I mean, everything was mono up to, as I said before. We were behind the times for stereo, and the mono mixes are the definitive mixes. I mean, that the CD mono set is the set of Beatles recordings to have at this stage. For the simple reason they were present when we actually did those mixes, and it has their input into those mixes as the amount of guitar or harmony vocal blend and so forth, The stereos they weren't present at. They were secondary as far as we were concerned, the stereo mixes. They weren't of not real importance, although we gave them the attention that they definitely needed at the time of doing them. I mean, Pepper, I think George and I mixed in 3 days. We didn't need any more time than 3 days to be able to mix it, because we're coming off of 4-track and injecting sound effects on some of the songs. The only thing I hated with the stereo mix was George Martin's decision to pan John's voice on Day in the Life, which I thought was ridiculous. So, which it does. I think John's voice moves across, so it took 3 days to mix the stereo, and on the monos after we finished a song, we always used to mix it. We didn't leave it till the end of an album; we just mixed it. And once it was mixed, and if there was anything missing or needed, we'd do it, and we never ever did edits either. It was never the accepted thing at EMI at that time. It was like an unwritten rule, I guess, that we never did we did some edits, but not many. So if I was mixing the single, and to them the fades were just as important as the song itself, because I'd come to the fade and you'd start fading, and then they'd want to just hear a little guitar figure a little bit louder, and then you'd pull it back, and then there'd be some other little noise that you just leave it and then pull it back, and then there'd be like this noise that you don't want at the end, which was right down at the bottom. So if I was mixing the thing and I let this little sound come through, we had to mix the whole thing again. I couldn't just do an edit piece for the end. So that's the way we used to approach those mixes. They were like performances. Edits were just, it's the easy way out. So every mix was a performance. And sometimes, because of doing that, you do something in the next mix that you hadn't done on the other mix, like lift a little guitar a little bit louder, or a little drum break a little louder, and that's much better, So that's how we used to mix,
It's it's fascinating, I'm sure, to everyone to hear how you achieved what you achieved, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about your post-Beatles work, and Elvis Costello will be here tomorrow, and that was we were listening to Imperial Bedroom. Talk about Elvis a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I can. I'll say some other, because then you'll hear what I'm trying to say. Because when I at the time of doing Imperial Bedroom, just prior to, I really was into Elvis as an artist, and I used to love his lyrics. But the problem to me was that sometimes I couldn't hear his lyrics. So when we started to do Imperial Bedroom, I really had on the monitor mixes and in the control room, I really had his voice up loud, and he'd never been used to hearing his voice that loud in the mixes, and it really sent him into it was like the first 2 weeks he had problems coming to terms with listening to his voice that loud, but listening to it in that was my approach on that album anyway. And also the other approach was I wanted to record it at 15 IPS and not 30. And that's what I did. So I did it at 15 IPS multi-track and 15 IPS when I mixed it to quarter inch, just to give it a certain texture. I didn't want it to really sound hi-fi. But obviously when, again, Elvis's voice was going through the Fairchild 660, and he was hearing his voice really amplified in his headphones, in his cans, when he's doing the vocals. And what I've noticed, or what I noticed yesterday from listening to, because I hadn't heard it for a long time, is the way he constructs and molds, because he's now hearing the ends of the words. So like the breaths and the T's and the S's, he's hearing really amplified, and he sort of crafts around that and sort of works that into the pronunciation of the words. And I only realised that for the first time listening to that track in your car. So that's all I can really say about working on that album, except it was a bit of a hard sort of slog doing it, and it was very. You have to catch, working with Elvis, you have to catch him. He's very spontaneous, and you have to catch him at a moment. He might just say, "I've got an idea, and I want to do it," and you just do it. You know, you haven't got time to get sounds and do it. You just have to record it, and that's the approach with Elvis at that time. But it's quite nice to hear the way he crafted the words, you know, because he's now hearing them really amplified in his headphones.
Well, I'm glad your point of view won out as a fan, because that and everything that followed, I thought really outstanding. There's one other thing I wanted to talk about. I know you part of this, I guess, like a Broadway show on the Beatles recording sessions. Could you sort of explain to everybody what it is, how you got involved, and your role in it and everything?
Yeah, well, we're going back 6 years now, when a producer read my book, and he said, "Do you think this would make a musical?" Because it had anecdotes in between the recording of the albums and certain, you know, little studio situations. So anyway, this was 6 years ago. So it came to fruition about 2 years ago when we started to plan and do it. So to cut a long story short again, the idea was the stage set would be we would rebuild number 2 Abbey Road Studio in its entirety as the stage set, which had the control room and the staircase and all these sort of attributes, like even the carpets with the holes in and everything all on the floor, and the old ashtrays. We had a model made of the Red 51 mixing console. And there's a George Martin character and a me character in the control room, although we don't play a big part in the show. So the idea was to present, for the first time live, all the Beatles songs, as many as we could do. And in fact, there were 60 of them, not in their entirety. Some were in medley form, as they sounded on the record, which meant having 2 sets, although we auditioned all over the place to find, obviously some people in Liverpool. 3 of the guys came from Liverpool, the young George Harrison, the McCartney and the Lennon, and there's an American Lennon and an American Ringo and an English Ringo. And so what we did, we were going to perform the songs as they sound on the records, which meant where we double track vocals, we needed 8 vocals on 9 vocals instead of just 4 vocals. So we had extra singers to complement that. The Beatle band itself was off stage, which created all the original guitar sounds and all the guitars we used on the songs. The drummer was on stage. He was the Ringo drummer. So they all had the same click tracks, and so did the vocalists. And I used what was the equivalent of what were 47 microphones, as I used to use in the studio for vocals. So there were 3 of those on the floor, and the whole thing, and we also had a 22-piece orchestra for where we needed orchestra on certain songs. And the whole thing was sort of choreographed, whereby some of the actors, i.e. being, there's a little crowd scene when they broke into the studio when we were doing She Loves You, when the fans broke in, and there's various other little anecdotes happen. So even moving the cables, because we kept to break it up, we moved the drums around the studio floor between songs. It meant altering the polar diagrams on the microphones, and so that people were allocated that job. But it was the same every night. They had the same movements, the same cable movements, the same movement of instruments, the mellotron for Strawberry Fields. So that was the premise of it. So for the first time, people were actually going to hear the records, because normally it was like 4 guys singing Beatles songs on a stage, and that was a Beatle look-alike band or sound-alike band. When I was watching the audience, because we had our premiere at the Royal Albert Hall about 5 weeks ago, and 2 days prior to that there was a performance in Liverpool, and then we went to Belfast and Dublin and back to England, and then so at the premiere in the Royal Albert Hall, you could see the people were just mesmerised, because what they were seeing, they were looking down on number 2 Abbey Road Studio and hearing the songs that they all loved as the songs they all loved, they sounded exactly like the records. And there's obviously standing ovation at the end, and the walls were constructed through see-through like net walls for the first half, and there was incredible lighting and great graphics added to the walls. And on the second half of the show, the walls are raised up, and then you see like all the other songs performed, so you could actually see more well into the studio. And the whole thing was running for about 2 hours and 40 minutes. But it was quite amazing to see the look on people's faces as they experienced listening to the songs live for the first time, because the Beatles could never even perform them live. But we actually made them sound, all the keyboard parts, all the sound effects. I mean, Tomorrow Never Knows sounds like Tomorrow Never Knows. Day in the Life sounded absolutely amazing. So that was the musical. And then because of the terrorism in Brussels pulled out, and then Germany got cold feet, and then France got cold feet, and the producers could absorb some cancellations, but not as many as that. So they cancelled the tour, and I think it's still going ahead in South Korea in June and Japan in July, and it's going to be rescheduled for Europe next year, and hopefully it will be here as well.
Yeah, I think all of us would love to see that.
Yeah.
Geoff, thank you very much on behalf of everybody.
Thank you.